Rye whiskey, rye whiskey, rye whiskey, I cry. If you don't give me rye whiskey, I surely will die.
Templeton, Iowa's bootleg whiskey was made with ordinary ingredients: water, yeast, sugar, rye. But the ingredients in its story are far from ordinary. Immigrant pioneers who built a town on America's prairie frontier. A war in Europe against the German Empire that led to a war in America on liquor and beer. Pro-prohibition vigilantes who were equal parts bigots and buffoons. A priest who kept a whiskey still in his residence and another in the church basement. Pigs who ate whiskey mash as forage until they were falling down drunk. A young man who learned to bootleg out of poverty and then became Templeton's bootlegger king. And a federal prohibition agent who would hunt Templeton's bootleggers for decades. This was the recipe that made Templeton, Iowa, the rye whiskey bootlegging capital of America's heartland.
I think Templeton was distinctive. There were other towns like that, but really the places where Prohibition was not even recognized as law were large coastal cities with large immigrant populations. The small town in the middle of the Midwest, not so common. And I think the conflict between Templeton and the people in the county to the south is an illustration of that. Well, here's this island in an area that is largely supportive of Prohibition. I said, well, what are these people doing up there?
On May 24th, 1882, a newspaper ad appeared in the Carroll County Times in western Iowa.
The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad is organizing a new town comprised of the finest farmland in Iowa. Lots are already selling rapidly in what will be one of the best and the most thriving towns in Carroll County. The Carroll Times.
That town became known as Templeton, settled almost entirely by German immigrants. Among them, Charles Romy from Heidelberg, Joseph Erlbeck from Lower Bavaria, and Father F.H. Hussmann from Oldenburg, who would become Templeton's beloved village priest. The Milwaukee Railroad began hauling workers in by the dozen. Businesses for the workers sprang up like weeds: hotels, stores, and saloons. Lots and lots of saloons. There was the D&L Saloon, Zitzelsberger's Saloon, the Ollinger Billiard Hall. The saloons served the railroad workers and the town's beer-loving German residents, who continued to arrive in waves. The influx even amazed Carroll's German-language newspaper.
Will ganz Deutschland nach Amerika kommen? Does all of Germany wish to come to America? The morning express train left no fewer than 68 families at the local train station who had made the trip to seek a new and happy home here in the distant west in Carroll County. Louis Kekkevoet was delighted over the arrival of his nephew, and for this purpose he was going to purchase a small keg. No, a truly large keg of beer. Der Carroll Demokrat 1882.
Along with their love of beer, the German immigrants brought to America their Catholicism, dedicating the impressive Sacred Heart Parish in 1900. For a time, the town also supported two Protestant churches, one Methodist and one Congregationalist, strongly pro-Prohibition denominations. But in 1903, the Methodists sold their church house. The new owner? A Templeton saloon keeper. On Easter Sunday, 1913, the Congregationalist church was destroyed by a tornado. It was never rebuilt. The Protestants' departure made Templeton that much more Catholic, that much more anti-prohibition, and years later, that much more ideal for bootlegging.
Well, Iowa was one of the big three, the three states that were most prohibition-minded. Certainly was Kansas. If you think of Carrie Nation, the Hatchetations, the breaking up of the bars, they had a really radical stance. Second was Maine. Maine would have a number of Maine laws. So they too had a very strong history. So Iowa had a long history from dating before the Civil War and that, because they wanted to be a really productive, upstanding, state. They wanted that reputation, for hard work, for clean living. So Iowa has prohibition 5 years before the nation has prohibition.
On August 3rd, 1804, nearly 80 years before Templeton's founding, Captains Meriwether Lewis and William Clark met the Oto Sioux Indian tribe near what would become Council Bluffs, Iowa. The explorers offered the tribe's chiefs gifts, including medals bearing the image of President Thomas Jefferson himself. Unimpressed, the Otos were blunt about what they really wanted: gunpowder and whiskey. Thus began the history of whiskey and alcohol in western Iowa. For the next 125 years, that history would pit anti-prohibition wets, brewers, saloon keepers, and German Catholics against pro-prohibition dries. Iowa's dries included various groups: the Woman's Christian Temperance Union, along with founding president Iowan Annie Wittenmeyer; the Methodist Church, including Minister George Haddock, who preached against Sioux City's saloons and breweries until he was silenced by an assassin's bullet; and less savory groups, such as the anti-immigrant Know-Nothings, who believed German and Irish immigrant votes could be bought with a stein of beer or a bottle of whiskey; and later, the Ku Klux Klan, which burned crosses from Dubuque to Cherokee to promote prohibition and scare immigrants and bootleggers. Above all, the Dries had the law. In 1882, prohibition was put to a statewide vote and passed easily. But Carroll County voters voted no. So for the next 50 years, they just ignored the dry laws. Carroll, the county seat, became a bootlegging hotbed. Bootleggers built saloons on skids, sliding them around town every night to stay ahead of the law. When Manning in southern Carroll County was founded, hopes ran high it would live up to its namesake, an Iowa prohibition leader. Instead, by the turn of the century, Manning's biggest claim to fame was the largest bar west of the Mississippi. Templeton, just east of Manning, managed to support 4 saloons during the era. Even so, Templeton City Council eventually enacted its own version of a prohibition law, an ordinance forbidding saloons from serving minors, alcoholics, and Native Americans. Decades of non-enforcement of prohibition laws led the Iowa legislature to finally crack down. On January 1st, 1916, 4 years before the 18th Amendment, strict statewide prohibition went into effect in Iowa. But prohibition advocates in Iowa and nationwide weren't satisfied. They wanted a federal constitutional prohibition amendment. At first, that seemed a pipe dream. Then came the war.
Prohibition wouldn't have happened had it not been for World War I. It was the clinching thing. But World War I creates this extraordinary anti-German feeling in this country, and the federal government fanned it. Wilson created an office to create more propaganda against everything German. And what was more German than beer? And what were the names of the brewers? They were Anheuser-Busch, and they were Schlitz, and they were Pabst, and Müller, which became Miller. They were all German. So these brewery owners, they were painted as the enemy of the American war effort. That finally was the last thing that was necessary to get the amendment approved by 36 states. It was the perfect timing.
On April 6, 1917, after the torpedoing of American ships by U-boats, the United States entered World War I.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Johnny, go behind, you're a son of a gun.
Some 30 Templetonians took up arms against Germany, the nation their families left just decades earlier. As they shipped out, Templeton's new troops were cheered at the Carroll Depot. But the war threatened their German-American families back home. In towns around Templeton, the war sparked vandalism or worse. Students burned German books. German newspaper offices were vandalized. A German farmer was dragged around a town square by a noose until he agreed to buy war bonds. A minister was nearly lynched for preaching in German. In Des Moines, Governor William Harding issued an executive order declaring it unlawful to speak German or any other foreign language in the state of Iowa. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Congress enacted the Food Control Act to conserve food for the war effort. In charge of its enforcement was U.S. Food Administrator and Iowa native Herbert Hoover. The legislation banned using grain to make liquor, the first ever federal prohibition law. Hoover thus became the Fed's first ever prohibition cop, a role he would repeat a decade later as President of the United States. As food administrator, Hoover linked food conservation to the fight against the German Kaiser. Prohibition advocates took note and began linking hatred of the German Kaiser into hatred for beer, liquor, and German-American brewers.
We have German enemies in this country, too. And the worst of all our German enemies, the most treacherous, the most menacing, are Pabst, Blatz, and Miller, Wisconsin Prohibition leader John Strange.
In December 1917, the Dries convinced Congress to pass a constitutional prohibition amendment. In 1918, the Allies turned the tide of the war, and the Dries won the Prohibition Amendment's ratification state by state. On November 11th, the armistice was signed. World War I was over. 69 days later, on January 16, 1919, the Nebraska legislature ratified the 18th Amendment, securing its final adoption. Booze was the last casualty of the Great War, and prohibition was now the law of the land. Near the Templeton train depot, the town blacksmith was busy. He filled a barrel with water, sugar, rye, and yeast, and let it ferment. He heated the mash in a coffee pot, letting the alcohol steam off, and catching it in a small condenser. The result was a sweet, smooth whiskey, the first batch of Templeton's bootleg rye. The blacksmith's name was, improbably, Herbert Hoover. Hoover soon left town, but he left behind his recipe. Soon, Templeton had numerous bootleggers, among them brothers Alphonse and Ed Kirchhoff.
My dad, Al Kirchhoff, he used to run Bowery dances along with his brother Ed Kirchhoff. The Bowery dance would be held in the open at night, and they would put up planks and a floor, and people could come from all over. And guys and women all came. They had accordion music, like old-time music, you know, polka music. Good dancing. Because Mom would tell that the young girls in those days, they kept cards of the young boys who wanted to dance with them. And they would have all their names on a card. And sometimes they would have 10 names on a card of guys waiting to dance with them. So if everybody came, that was their customers, see? And Dad could sell whiskey to all of these guys. And back then, I think Mom said the ladies really didn't drink much. They were very proper and prim. And that's how Dad and his brother Ed sold a lot of whiskey at that time.
Private Lawrence Bach returned from the Army to Templeton when Prohibition went into effect. He discovered Templeton had been forever changed by the war. The area's German newspapers had folded. Templeton's saloons and beer gardens were now all illegal. The membership of the anti-Catholic Ku Klux Klan continued to grow in surrounding counties. Many German Catholic Templetonians responded by further assimilating. Others responded with defiance. Some refused to give up their language. Templeton's priest, Father Henry Friedrich Hussmann, continued to give sermons in German. Father Hussmann also organized a Templeton chapter of the pro-immigrant Catholic lay group, the Knights of Columbus. Others refused to give up alcohol and became bootleggers, including Private Bach. Lawrence Bach and his friend Joe Erlbeck spent the cold winter of 1920 hunkered down in a farmhouse teaching themselves how to distill bootleg whiskey. Erlbeck proved the star distiller. He would later become Templeton's greatest bootlegger. In 1920, the new Federal Prohibition Bureau began hiring agents to enforce the National Prohibition Act. But few of the feds were up to the job. Case in point, Council Bluffs agents, after a long investigation, tracked down where that city's biggest gang was getting its whiskey. They were stealing it from the agent's own evidence locker. Other law enforcement agents received dubious help from pro-prohibition vigilantes, including the infamous Ku Klux Klan.
There are cases where Klan members would accompany the local sheriff if they would get a tip that a certain farmer had a still operation. Some Klan members would go along with the sheriff.
In Buena Vista County, north of Carroll, the Klan, certain that the county's Catholic prosecutor was blocking prohibition enforcement, threatened to take matters into their own hands.
We have a Klan sheriff, but our prosecuting attorney is a fish eater. The Klan is going to go right after the bootleggers, and we're going to call on some of these dark nights, about 12 o'clock. John Smith, Marathon, Iowa chapter, Knights of the Ku Klux Klan.
In Story County to the east, the Klan did just that. One September night before a bootlegger was to go on trial, the hooded vigilantes burned a cross in front of the bootlegger's home. When the Klan did it again the next night, the bootlegger jumped bail rather than stick around for his trial. But the Klan was less successful spreading its anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, and anti-bootlegging message in overwhelmingly wet German and Catholic Carroll County. The Klan planned an outdoor organizing meeting in Carroll, complete with fiery burning crosses, but they were preemptively shut down by the Carroll Fire Department. The Klan clearly wasn't going to be able to go after Carroll County's bootleggers, but one man was. The sheriff from Audubon County, just 3 miles south of Templeton. Audubon County, just south of Templeton, was majority Protestant and had been dry for most of its history. In 1916, the year Iowa reinstated strict prohibition, Audubon elected as sheriff a former blacksmith and volunteer fireman, Benjamin Franklin Wilson. A few years later, on September 20th, 1919, Sheriff Wilson would make his first big booze bust and find his life's calling. That day, Wilson arrested a bootlegger at a dance near the Carroll County line. The bootlegger's supplier was based in Carroll County, so Sheriff Wilson referred the case to his counterpart to the north, but the Carroll sheriff sat on the case, taking no action. Wilson was furious. It marked the first, but not the last he would run into Carroll County's conspiracy of silence. It also marked the first shot in what would become Frank Wilson's 15-year war against Carroll County's whiskey cookers. On March 3, 1920, Templeton town jeweler Henry Vermeulen was hard at work, but he wasn't fixing a watch or a necklace. He was writing a letter blowing the whistle on Templeton's bootleggers addressed to the Attorney General of the United States in Washington, D.C.
Templeton, Iowa, March 3, 1920. Honorable Sir, in this locality a shrewd government agent will find several illicit stills. Most of the population here voiced their intention of defying the government in this nefarious business. Stills or breweries, also moonshine, will be found in the possession of the following persons: Bert Hoover, V.C. Swaller, and many more. Your men might find something of interest in the basement of the Catholic Church here, or in the priest's residence. Most respectfully, H.F. Vermeulen.
He would have to wait 2 years. Bert Vermeulen would soon witness the biggest roundup of bootleggers in the history of Carroll County. On June 26, 1922, 7 federal agents, the Audubon sheriff, and 10 volunteer deputies piled into 5 cars and headed up U.S. Highway 71. The biggest bootlegging raid in Carroll County history was underway. By day's end, the raiders seized 15 stills, 125 gallons of liquor, 2,500 gallons of mash, $50,000 total contraband, and arrested 22 bootleggers. The dragnet went smoothly, though the raiders did encounter some resistance.
The wives of some of the men put up strenuous fights, and several of them had to be subdued forcibly. Most of them would attempt to destroy the liquor as soon as the officers entered the house, and in preventing this, the officers found in several cases that the women put up a good deal more resistance than their husbands. The Audubon Advocate.
The raid was masterminded by the Fed's newest recruit, a man with a special place in his heart for Templeton. Former Audubon sheriff and now federal prohibition agent, Frank Wilson. For a time, Wilson and the Feds seemed to shut down Carroll County's bootleggers, but they couldn't shut down its juries.
jury nullification, which is to say the act of juries refusing to convict because they did not agree with the law or did not think that the penalties were appropriate for the violation, begins to show up really within the first couple of years of Prohibition, spottily. First in the East, in the big cities of the East. And it became, in places like Boston, New York, it became almost impossible to convict.
If one of your neighbors was involved in the bootlegging business, either in a small way or even in a somewhat larger way, you were very unlikely to call the police and to turn them in, and you were certainly unlikely on a jury to vote to convict them.
The press did become aware of it. Everybody became aware of it. The prosecutions really became aware of it, and they begin, by the time the middle toward the end of Prohibition, they're much more careful in the cases they're bringing because they realize that in certain localities, they're not going to get a conviction from a group of jurors who know that this is the guy that they get their beer from.
On March 16, 1925, the bootlegging case State versus Hyries was gavelled to order at the Carroll Courthouse. The Carroll Times reported.
The courtroom was well filled with spectators during the progress of the trial, much interest being shown by people from all sections of Carroll County. Judge McCord experienced some difficulty in maintaining order. Not for a long time has such outbursts been heard in the district courtroom in Carroll, as the crowd seemed to want to applaud many of the points brought out by attorneys for the defendant. It was very evident that the sympathy of those who filled the courtroom was with Mr. Hyers.
On Tuesday, jury deliberations began. The initial vote, 6 to acquit, 6 to convict. As the night wore on, 3 jurors switched, 9 to acquit, 3 to convict. By Wednesday, the jury informed the judge it would be unable to reach a verdict. Carroll County's first big booze trial ended deadlocked, with no conviction, a hung jury. Carroll's juries had provided the county's bootleggers with perhaps the most crucial ingredient for their famous rye whiskey, a get-out-of-jail-free card.
It was absolutely an industry around here at that time. And along with that, it saved a lot of people, saved their farms, and brought a lot of new Oldsmobiles into the community because they traded booze for Oldsmobiles. I know.
In the 1920s, the farm depression descended over Iowa's prairie, ruining farmers. But in Templeton, the 20s roared. Main Street glistened with shiny new cars. Joe Earlbeck had an Oldsmobile touring sedan. Al Kirchhoff had a new Ford pickup. Nick Lippold owned a Model A. The source of Templeton's prosperity was no great mystery. It could be found and purchased by the glass, in pint flasks, or in gallon jugs all around town. At Ollinger Billiard Hall, at Templeton's weekly boxing matches, at the Joyce Lumber Yard where Joe Earlbeck met clients. Everyone in Templeton was ready for a piece of the action. Town grocer Frank Gredeman stocked kegs underneath a sign reading, "Not to be used for alcoholic beverages." Town welder Weed Hacker sold livestock feed boilers, a product suspiciously similar to a whiskey still. Joe Schumacher maintained the train depot, where 100-pound bags of sugar would be offloaded at night and disappear by morning. Templeton's bootleggers also found allies in the town's civic and moral leaders. Not long after Prohibition's enactment, Town Mayor Lou Ritton decided to resign his post. He was too busy as town pharmacist selling medicinal whiskey. After 2 terms, his successor, Mayor John Birrell, tired of presiding over drunken, disorderly arrests, also retired. Then he himself was arrested for bootlegging. The next mayor, town doctor Otis Morgenthaler, let bootleggers turn Templeton's water tower on after midnight so they could fill up under the cover of darkness. But perhaps the most influential member of Templeton's bootlegging conspiracy was the town priest, Father Henry Friedrich Hussmann, or, as he was sometimes called, God's whiskey inspector for western Iowa. Hussmann's taste for rye meant the town's bootleggers were spared from any disapproving sermons at Sunday Mass. He kept a still in the church basement and another at his residence, sharing his supply with the Sacred Heart School nuns, who shared his taste for what they called Templeton medicine.
Father Hussmann's involvement in the Templeton Rye story was really important. He was the community's moral leader, the one who said, "This is okay." And that really set Templeton apart from a lot of the other communities. In other places in the Midwest, the clergy were saying, you know, breaking the law is wrong. But in Templeton, Father Hussmann himself was even a bootlegger.
As Templeton's 20s roared, its prosperity was not lost on Agent Frank Wilson, and it only made him more determined to shut the party down. On a February day, Frank Wilson launched another dragnet to round up Carroll County's bootleggers.
Another attempt was made Saturday to dry up western Iowa's oasis. 24 federal, state, and county officials swooped down in the vicinity of Dedham, Templeton, and Coon Rapids in an effort to wipe out the moonshine ring operating a wholesale liquor business. The raid was unsuccessful, officers declare. There was much evidence that the bootleggers knew the raid had been planned. Several places were visited which bore evidence that mash had been poured out on the ground and liquor-making devices destroyed. The Audubon Republican.
Someone was tipping off the bootleggers. Was it the Carroll sheriff, whose family once owned a Templeton saloon? Was it the Carroll court clerk from a bootlegging family? Or was it Templeton's switchboard operator, the wife of a whiskey cooker? In their game of cat and mouse, the bootleggers were also using better and better hiding places. Whiskey was hidden all over the area. In haylofts, in corn shocks, in snowbanks, under parked tractors. Entire stills were being set up in hog houses, under feedlots, or under chicken coops.
To age whiskey is quite a technique, you know. You gotta revolve it in a charred barrel. So our neighbor to the south, about 2 miles, he had one technique that was hard to beat. He'd put the kegs in the sow lot, right along Highway 71 then. And the hogs would bump, rub, and kick that barrel around all day. And as they were doing that, they were aging that whiskey for him. It worked.
Templeton's rum runners were just as crafty. The town undertaker and his wife ran whiskey to the cities hidden in their hearse. Between runs, they kept the booze hidden in empty coffins.
But I just remember walking what we called walk uptown, and I would cross the alley and go and look on the right, and there would be the doors open, and I could see the coffins with all this liquor in there, all this whiskey, and I thought that was awful.
Local tradition had booze being hidden in empty graves, even the cemetery monument of Templeton's first Catholic priest. Most of all, bootleggers were helped by friends willing to lend a hand.
My uncle, he was coming back from one of the stills and he had an old Chevrolet and the feds were chasing him into town. He jumped out of the car, ran across the street here to the tavern just next door. The feds came in and, "What do you want him for?" He said, "Well, the car is registered in his name," and they had the registration. And so the guy behind the bar, or whoever was working in the bar, said, "Well, you go down the corner, go up to the church, make a left, and then there's a lane you take south." And they had sent him up to the cemetery. And when they came back, they were not very happy, and the upshot was that my uncle had this car registered in a dead man's name for a couple of years.
The feds did on occasion get their men, such as when they raided Frank Fisher's farm, chopped up his still, and gave his hogs a bad hangover right in front of Fisher's young daughter, Hilda.
Revenue guys come there. They went right down with their axe and chopped the still, and the whiskey smelled real strong down there. And then we saw the hogs. They ate the mash. Dad had them in a little pen right outside of that hog house. There was 3 hogs, I think, 2 or 3 hogs. And they got in there and then they ate that mash and scooped up that whiskey, and I guess it got too much. Dad didn't think it was so funny.
The feds were having even better luck in Audubon County to the south. On June 17, 1927, agents discovered a still on a farm less than a mile south of the county line. The farmer said the still didn't belong to him, but to a bootlegger soon to be known as the Kingpin of Templeton, Joe Earlbeck.
Oh yeah, Joe Earlbeck. I think he was one of the big ones during the Prohibition with the liquor. He was a good-looking guy, and he lived in one of the best homes in Templeton. And I always wondered where he got his money, but maybe he did, and maybe he was selling it. I don't know.
Joe Earlbeck Jr. was born in 1899, one of 11 children. He planned to follow his father into farming until he had his first sip of whiskey. After the 18th Amendment went into effect in 1920, Joe, just 21 years old, became one of Templeton's youngest and best bootleggers.
You know, as a young kid, he told me that he generally had $1,000 in $100 bills in the bib of his overall. He was 21 years old, and he was probably one of the wealthiest men in town, next to the banker in those days, or the doctor, I guess, in those days.
Earlbeck kept a low profile, avoiding arrest until he was picked up in 1927, unluckily, in Audubon County. The arrest almost ended his career. Instead, it taught him the keys to his future bootlegging empire. First, he needed to keep his operations in bootlegger-friendly Carroll County. Second, he needed to partner with farmers who would take the fall when the feds raided. And from time to time, he would need some good luck.
He didn't think of himself as a kingpin. I mean, I think he just enjoyed it. He enjoyed anything he did.
At the height of his operations, Joe Earlbeck had 40 employees and a 1,000-gallon daily production capacity. He began supplying Des Moines through the city's bootlegging boss, Kenneth Sonderleiter. Once, Sonderleiter's men came to Templeton and loaded up 3,200 gallons of Earlbeck's prized rye. Destination, Chicago. Earlbeck would occasionally make small deliveries to Chicago himself, hiding 5-gallon tins under his Oldsmobile's back seat. After delivering the goods, he would celebrate with a night of cards or on a Cubs game at Wrigley Field. Earlbeck also kept up his retail sales at Joyce Lumber. Earlbeck would meet clients, set a keg on his car's roof, place 1-gallon jugs along his Oldsmobile's running board, and fill orders on the spot. The inflation-adjusted tax-free price for a gallon of Earlbeck's Rye Whiskey, $75. On January 29, 1929, Joe Earlbeck married Loretta Greteman. For their honeymoon, the incurably romantic Joe took Loretta to Kentucky's Bourbon Country. They returned to Templeton for the wedding of Loretta's brother and Joe's fellow bootlegger, Felix Greteman. That cold February, they toasted the newlyweds and their bootlegging empire. They had no idea it would all soon start to unravel.
That you will preserve, maintain, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I do.
On March 4th, 1929, Iowa-born Herbert Hoover was sworn in as President of the United States. Hoover took a law and order approach to Prohibition. He was horrified by the lawlessness engulfing America's cities like Chicago, where on February 14th, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre shocked the nation. That crime, coming just 3 weeks before his inauguration, led Hoover to deliver a blunt command to the Justice Department: get Al Capone, referring to the crime boss believed to be behind the massacre.
October 17th, Chicago, Illinois. A federal jury found Chicago crime boss Al Capone guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion.
Capone was definitely undone by a couple of Iowans. George E.Q. Johnson was from Iowa. He was the lawyer, the U.S. attorney who was assigned to prosecute Capone. And the judge in the case, Judge Wilkerson, was also an Iowan. I think these guys from Iowa really believed that small-town values still mattered, that Prohibition was the law of the land, and whether you liked it or not, you better deal with it. And their jobs were to enforce the law. And they were hell-bent not just on enforcing the law, but on making an example of Al Capone, because Capone so openly flouted the law.
Sentence ever given, along with heavy fines and liens against the Miami, Florida mansion where he has lived since 1929.
At 6:30 a.m. on March 4th, the very same day Herbert Hoover was inaugurated as president, Rose Galloway awoke in her Templeton home. She called for her son, Franklin, but got no answer. She opened the basement door. There, lying unconscious on the landing, was her son. He was dead, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning from his whiskey still. A few days later, all Templeton gathered at Sacred Heart Church for the funeral. Near the church, another group gathered: Frank Wilson's federal agents. They kept their distance during the funeral. Then they moved in. Galloway's death meant that bootlegging in Templeton would never again be seen as a victimless crime. It muted the roar of Templeton's Roaring Twenties. Soon enough, the Roaring Twenties would come to a crashing halt everywhere. On Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange dropped 12%, beginning its historic crash. The Great Depression had begun.
Brother, can you spare a dime?
1 in 4 Americans were soon unemployed. Thousands of banks failed. Farmers by the thousands lost their farms. Remarkably, or perhaps not so remarkably, Carroll County had the lowest bank failure and farm foreclosure rates in all of Iowa. But Iowa farmers were hit just as hard as the rest of America's farmers by decimated crop prices. One farmer, Frank Nepple, approached Joe Earlbeck. With 9 children, Nepple needed any extra income he could find. He asked Earlbeck if he would have any business needs. Soon, a new improvement was installed on Nepple's farm: 2 250-gallon whiskey stills. The operation soon became Earlbeck's most productive distillery, at least until Frank Wilson caught wind of it. On the night of March 3, 1931, Prohibition agents Frank Wilson and Forrest Burris drove 4 miles northwest of Templeton. They had received a tip they would find something on the farm of Frank Nepple. They were not disappointed. They crawled through a ditch toward a dimly lit hog house. Inside, someone was hard at work, but he wasn't slopping the pigs.
I could smell a strong odor of mash in the process of distillation, and said ditch, in which I was in, came within the vicinity of said building. I am positive that a still is being operated in said building. Prohibition agent Forrest Burris.
The next night, the agents returned with a full raiding party. Sure enough, they discovered the hog house was actually a still house. Inside, they found 2 250-gallon stills, 100 empty kegs, 5,500 gallons of mash, and 1,000 gallons of whiskey. The only thing the feds didn't find was a bootlegger. They woke Frank Nepple, placing the farmer, still in his pajamas, under arrest. Then they asked, where were the bootleggers? Nepple swore the stills were his. The agents knew better, so they hunkered down and waited. Frank Wilson's investigation memo detailed what happened next.
At about 3 a.m. on the morning of March 5, 1931, a car came into the yard and drove directly west of the hog house. The defendant, Joseph Urbeck, got out and started to go to the still house, where he was met by Deputy Administrator Parsons. Urbeck asked Deputy Parsons who he was and what he was doing there.
Urbeck was then informed he was under arrest. On June 16, 1931, the federal grand jury at Fort Dodge, Iowa, began hearing the case of United States versus Joseph Urbeck. The prosecutors called on their star witnesses. First, farmer Frank Nepple, but Nepple refused to turn on Urbeck, again swearing the stills were his and his alone. The prosecutors then called another witness, Templeton Savings Bank president Frank Schreck. The prosecution knew Schreck held Urbeck's accounts and hoped he would turn on his client.
Well, didn't you worry about this amount of money coming in here daily?
Gentlemen, I don't know if you're familiar with the banking business or not. It is not customary for the banker to ask any questions when his customer brings in money. We only ask questions when they want to borrow.
The prosecutors had blown the case. When the grand jury foreman handed over the indictment to the court clerk, Joe Urbeck's name had been crossed out, indicating no indictment. Once again, Templeton's conspiracy of silence had beaten Frank Wilson.
Our mayor hung a big banner across the street up here advertising Templeton Rye.
At Christmas time.
At Christmas time. Well, that just agitated all the feds around, you know. That's when they start putting the heat on us here.
Well, that was the end of it.
In December 1931, an article appeared in the Des Moines Register.
Enterprising citizens of Templeton have erected above the garlands which adorn Main Street a good-sized replica of the little brown jug used to dispense the community's own brand of rye. On the jug are the words, Xmas Spirits. Had it not been for a recent upturn in the Templeton rye business cycle, many a child of distiller and bootlegger might have had to go without Christmas toys. But there is a Santa Claus after all, and the stimulus of purchases by those who want a bit of a nip for holiday cheer has lifted business from the depths of depression. The Des Moines Register.
No doubt Templetonians thought a little Christmas humor was all in good fun, especially after Joe Urbeck beat the rap. Instead, it sparked outrage all around Iowa, as many felt the little brown jug was proof positive all of Templeton was part of a bootlegging conspiracy. That was the case Agent Frank Wilson was about to make. He just needed a break in the case, and he would soon get it. On March 18, 1932, Steve Smith was running to a small shed in Templeton. The shed housed a makeshift whiskey aging plant, an ingenious but dangerous contraption that, without proper operation, could easily explode. On this morning, Smith was late, perilously late. After Smith arrived, the rig blew. A few days later, Agent Frank Wilson arrived to investigate. His report detailed.
On March 18, 1932, one Steve Smith of Templeton, Iowa, was brought to said hospital. Smith was very reluctant in relating his history as required of all patients upon entering the hospital.
But Wilson already knew Smith's personal history. A few weeks earlier, at the Burke Hotel in Carroll, Wilson had met with an informant who had disclosed the name of Smith's employer, Joe Earlbeck.
Rye whiskey, rye whiskey, rye whiskey, I cry. If you don't give me rye whiskey, I surely will die. If the ocean was...
By 1932, the farm depression was entering its second decade. Farmers were helpless as banks foreclosed on their farms. Iowa farmers organized a farm strike, setting up roadblocks to stop farmers who refused to join their cause. Outside Sioux City, a truck tried to run a roadblock. The farmers shot and killed the driver. He turned out to be a young teenage boy hauling bootleg whiskey into the city. Against the backdrop of the Great Depression, Prohibition was becoming an increasing.
Remember,
In 1932, the Democratic Party nominated Franklin Delano Roosevelt for president. Roosevelt stayed silent on prohibition. The Democrats' party platform did not. It endorsed prohibition's immediate repeal. If Frank Wilson was going to get Joe Earlbeck, he was going to have to move fast. On a bright June day, Joe Earlbeck pulled his Oldsmobile into his garage. Two cars sped forward, blocking him. Out jumped U.S. Marshals, who ordered Earlbeck to raise his hands, placing him under arrest. Earlbeck was arraigned the next day in Fort Dodge on multiple counts of conspiracy to violate the National Prohibition Act. It looked like Joe Earlbeck's luck had finally run out.
now a word as to beer. I favor the modification of the Boston Act just as fast as the Lord will let us.
On the eve of the 1932 election, Democratic presidential nominee Franklin Roosevelt made a campaign speech endorsing the legalization of light beer, even before Prohibition was repealed. It was a hit with the crowd and the electorate. As president, the first three laws FDR sent to Congress were a bank emergency bill, a balanced budget bill, and a bill to legalize light beer. Across the nation and back in Templeton, the beer taps that had been dry for nearly 13 years soon began flowing again, including at the Templeton Billiard Hall, now renamed the Templeton Tap Room. Joe Earlbeck decided it was safe to make one of his last big deliveries of Templeton rye. His destination, the Democratic Party headquarters in Des Moines. The client, the incoming administration of Governor-elect Clyde Herring. Frank Wilson knew his chance to get Joe Earlbeck was slipping away. An expedited trial was set. Wilson assembled a witness list and began preparing subpoenas, including one for Templeton Town Mayor, Otis Morgenthaler. But Morgenthaler was already on official government business that summer. In July, Morgenthaler was representing Carroll County at the Iowa Convention on the 21st Amendment to repeal Prohibition. The final tally was 90 delegates for repeal, 0 opposed. Frank Wilson had hunted Templeton's bootleggers for 15 years. He had hunted Joe Earlbeck for 7 years. This time, Wilson surely had Earlbeck cornered. But once again, there would be no conviction or long sentence. By Earlbeck's court date, November 24th, the 21st Amendment was just 4 states short of final ratification. With the writing on the wall, a plea bargain was struck. Earlbeck pleaded no contest, and Judge George Scott fined him just $750. 2 weeks later, on December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment to the United States was officially ratified. Prohibition was over, and so was the era of Templeton Rye.